Well, good day and welcome to today's webinar, Takeaways from the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, courtesy of LMG Security. My name is Deanna Keller and I'm your moderator for today. Before we start the program, I'd like to give you some housekeeping information. First, we encourage attendees to use the computer audio feature of this webinar. During the program, should you experience any audio interference, such as static or intermittent audio due to a busy network, please use the optional phone connection, which is listed in the audio tab of the webinar interface. Second, we will have a question and answer session at the end of the program. You may submit questions anytime by using the questions tab in the webinar interface or save them until the end. Any handouts that are available will be located in the handouts tab. The video of the webinar will be available after the event and attendees will receive a notification once the video is live, which also includes the links to any provided supplemental files. Feel free to download these helpful files for your reference later on. Last, but certainly not least, a survey will be available to you at the conclusion of this webinar. Please take the opportunity to provide feedback on your webinar experience. Our presenter for the webinar today is Sherry Davidoff. Sherry is the CEO of LMG Security and author of the new book, Data Breaches. As a recognized expert in cybersecurity and data breach response, Sherry has been called a security badass by the New York Times. She has provided cybersecurity training for the American Bar Association, FDIC, Department of Defense, and many others. Her professional experiences are featured in the book, Breaking and Entering, The Extraordinary Story of a Hacker Called Alien. Sherry is a GIAC certified forensic examiner and a penetration tester, receiving her degree in computer science and electrical engineering from MIT. Sherry, I am passing you control of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Deanna, and thanks everybody for tuning in today. I'm quite excited to tell you about what is in the latest Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. And to give you some background on this, as a specialist in data breaches, I've been following the evolution of the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report for all 13 years that it's been in existence. They started off analyzing a caseload of about 500 cases, and then they brought in cases from a partnership with the Secret Service. And nowadays there are 81 contributing organizations in 81 different countries around the world. And LMG Security, our forensics team, is one of them. So that's very exciting to be collaborating on that. This year, we saw 157,525 incidents. Of those, 3,950 were data breaches. And the difference between an incident and a breach is not a simple matter. So just to make sure we know what we're talking about, in the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, an incident is some kind of security-related event that may compromise the integrity, confidentiality, or availability of an information asset. That is different from a breach. A breach is where they confirm that the disclosure occurred and not that there's just some kind of potential exposure. That's different than what a breach is in many state laws. In some state laws, just because an attacker had access to a computer with sensitive data, you might have to declare that as a breach. In HIPAA, the federal law, HIPAA and high-tech presumes that an access is a security breach unless you can demonstrate otherwise, you show evidence otherwise. So this definition of breach is a little bit different than the legal definition that you may see. Verizon has come up with a framework, Veris, that helps make sure that everyone is reporting breaches and aspects of breaches consistently. And you'll see us reference some of the Veris terms throughout this presentation. So anyway, very valuable tool that you're about to see here. It really gives us a much clearer picture of what's going on today, and hopefully it will help to inform your cybersecurity habits and programs. So today we'll start off by digging into who are the perpetrators of data breaches, who's behind this. We will discuss their motivations, why they're doing this, and then their methods. How are they getting into your organizations? How are they stealing information? We'll also talk about what's not happening this year. We are seeing some types of attacks going down or becoming far less than they once were. They're not as much an issue as they were in past years, so we'll talk about that. And finally, we'll give you a summary of how you can protect yourself and your organization from today's threats. I do want to mention also that at LMG, we have a Cyber Summer Intensive Training event. Really excited about this. It is our first time running these 2 classes virtually at all. So I will be teaching a class on data breach investigation and response, including ransomware breaches, cloud breaches, you name it. And my colleagues Babak Javadi and Deviant Olaf will be teaching physical access control systems. So if you ever wanted to know how to red team your organization, how to break in to access control systems, they are going to show you how to do it. So that's June 23rd and 24th and the 25th and 26th. One big thing that has been hitting the news lately is ShinyHunters. It sounds so nice, this group, so friendly, ShinyHunters. But they have been responsible for the release of millions of stolen records on the dark web. They've just been on a spree, and it's odd because they seem to come out of nowhere. They've hacked all kinds of different organizations. Many of them are involved in online learning, for example, or food delivery, things like that, that are very common in the days of coronavirus. It makes sense that attackers would be targeting these organizations because they want to go after people who are financially in a good spot so that they can get paid. So here's one example of data that they stole and are now selling on the dark web. They're calling it first stage, like there's other stages to come. And they're selling it to anyone who will buy it. In this case, 25 million records, usernames and encrypted passwords are going for $4,000, 4,000 US dollars. And it seems like they're going to be selling these multiple times. There's no guarantee of exclusivity or anything along those lines. So they're just one example of an organized crime group that we're seeing. Organized crime actors made up over 50% of all criminals behind the attacks. And you can see nation state was far less than that, only about 10% of the people behind attacks. Further down, you can see system administrators and end users are also behind attacks, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But first, let's dig into organized crime. Who are these criminals? This also, if you're wondering about the quality of the data, this does tie in nicely to what we're seeing other organizations report as well. And remember, these are not scientists monitoring some global statistics about information on data breaches. All of these industry reports we get are inherently biased because it's a sample just of the information that they were able to collect as private organizations. And typically, if a forensic firm is involved, or Verizon is involved, or law enforcement's involved in analyzing and investigating a potential data breach, that's already just a subset of all the breaches that are out there because someone has to find that, report it, hire a third-party investigator to do that. So all of these statistics are going to be skewed. But what we see is that this trend of organized crime and the nation-state attackers is in line with what we were seeing with CrowdStrike. So in CrowdStrike, this other organization, in 2018, they saw that their cases were primarily state-sponsored, and then eCrime, their organized crime groups, made up only 25%. That changed in 2020. In 2020, eCrime was almost 2/3 of their cases, and state-sponsored was about 39%. And again, this may vary depending on this company's specific caseload, but it's nice to see that those top 2 actors, eCrime and state-sponsored, are the same as the ones we see in the Verizon data breach investigations report. Let's just take a quick little detour as we're going through and talk about the inherent bias so we can think about this critically. Again, any of these vendor reports are relying on information that they can get. And sometimes there's conclusion, so you have to be careful when drawing conclusions. This is an example of a conclusion Trend Micro drew. They're another company that did an analysis and found the healthcare sector was most affected by data breaches, followed by government and retail sectors. That was back in 2015. And it set off a slew of headlines that said healthcare biggest offender in 10 years of data breaches. And Trend Micro themselves encouraged this. They said an increase in the number of reported incidents strongly indicates that the total volume of data breaches has also risen and vice versa. Is this true? Absolutely not. We often see data breaches going up because of changes in laws, changes in how organizations get audited. So we're seeing more and more healthcare report over the past decade because of the HITECH Act and because of how people's expectations of healthcare providers and requirements to notify. We can also see increases because of journalists learning how to investigate certain types of incidents. Retail breaches are a good example where Brian Krebs really came up with a recipe for uncovering merchant breaches and started reporting those. The Target breach was one of those first key examples. And it wasn't necessarily that retail breaches were going up, although they may have been also, but it's that these breaches were being discovered and reported. So keep that in mind as we go through these. Feel free to ask questions critically. There is no question, however, that organized crime groups are making a lot of money off of data breaches these days. So this is the TA 505 criminal gang. You may also know them as EvilCorp. I think that's the best name for a hacker group ever. And they took a little hiatus for a while. They're the big hacking group behind Dridex and some other really huge banking Trojans and ransomware strains. They were actually indicted by the US government at the end of last year, although there's a very low chance that they will actually be put in jail. We believe they are based in Russia. Their fearless leader, we know, has made at least $100 million from his crimes. So in this case, they took a little hiatus and all of a sudden, poof, they've come back in the past few months. So here you can see a headline. They're deploying SDB bot for corporate network takeover. So they're specifically aiming to take over corporate networks. They're also targeting HR departments with poisoned CVs. That's a really tough one because your HR department needs to open those Word documents. I'm sure many of you have opened a Word document for this purpose, reviewed someone's resume, and poof, those can be infected. So really nasty stuff. Again, we are seeing them launching different types of coronavirus campaigns. This is one from the TA 505 group, how to protect your friends from the coronavirus. And if you click on that link, you may find yourself infected. We also find that more and more of these groups are leveraging services like cloud providers that are very innocuous. So keeping documents in Google Drive, for example, where it looks like a normal place, it's not going to raise any red flags, but then of course it's malware or malicious. Other organized crime groups are in the ransomware space. So we've seen the group behind Sysadmins ransomware makes up about 1/3 of all ransomware cases. They have been very successful. If you tuned into our ransomware webinar back in March, you saw some screenshots of the commercial ransomware software that they're using. They have a little web portal. Ryuk is another one that's been very successful, another popular organized crime group. Then we have Phobos and Dharma. So those are the big ones these days in the ransomware space. And many of these groups have affiliate relationships. I think this is really important to understand that it is a business in so many different ways. So there's just a headline out this week. The Prolock ransomware is teaming up with the Quackbot Trojan to infect victims. So the Trojan is getting access to that system, and then the Prolock, the ransomware folks, are maybe paying them some money to go and install their ransomware after the fact. In the bottom right, you can see a screenshot about how the gangs relating to Emotet work. Emotet, of course, started off as a banking Trojan. It was designed to steal usernames and passwords, and then it evolved. The criminals behind it realized, okay, if we can get bank account or credit union usernames and passwords, then we can also get usernames and passwords to other websites. And if we can do that, well, why don't we just steal files from their computer? And if we can steal files from their computer, then hey, we can let other criminals install their malware on here too and get them to pay us for it. And that's what they do. So they have a relationship with the creators of TrickBot, which is another type of banking Trojan that focuses on password theft. The creators of TrickBot will also install Ryuk, the Ryuk ransomware, when they're done. And similarly, Dridex, the Dridex banking Trojan, can be used to install the BitPaymer ransomware. So often at LMG, when we see a ransomware case, we'll identify it as Ryuk or BitPaymer, and then we'll go looking for Dridex, or we'll go looking for TrickBot, or the other really nasty thing that's been lurking on the network, making it facilitating that infection. So affiliate relationships. And again, just to show you how sophisticated they are, this is the Maze Group. The Maze Group has been holding people for ransom. They've really risen to prominence this year because of exposure extortion. So if people aren't paying them to get their data back, they decided to dump it out to the world. And here you can see from their website a little Q&A. What should you do if being locked? They want you to get into communication with them. If you think the price is too high, make an offer. Number 3, please don't disappear from negotiations. Your relationship with these criminals is important. They say you can always spend 5 minutes to notify us that something happened. Come on, guys. And then number 4, don't think you'll be cheated. We value our reputation. So again, this is a business and they recognize that in order for people to keep paying them, they need to have a reputation for providing the data when you do pay them. Another question that comes up, where are the attackers? The Verizon data breach report referenced this. They actually referenced an FBI document that described this. But attackers are 85% of the time in the same country as the victim. That's amazing because we often think of attackers as being someplace really far away. 56% of the time, more than half the time, attackers are in the same state, and 35% they're in the same city. And we see that happening a lot, in particular because of the larger metropolitan areas like LA and New York, where there are cyber criminal gangs and they're just attacking people in their local environments. It can also make monetization, like actually monetizing the data you steal, easier in some cases if you're in geographic proximity. All right, let's look at a couple other reasons that people hack. Nation state attackers hack. And that's come up just in the past few months. So Equifax, of course, was notably hacked a couple years ago when actually it ended up being more than 143 million. I think it was 145 or 146 million people's social security numbers and other sensitive information were leaked. And the way the hackers did this was that they broke into an unpatched server using an Apache Struts vulnerability. That was a very widespread vulnerability at the time, made a lot of news, and there was a patch out for it. So Equifax was raked over the coals at the time. Turns out that this was the work of 4 Chinese hackers who have been targeting organizations, corporations all over the world, trying to gather as much data as possible. So they were indicted by the Department of Justice. Again, very unlikely that we're actually going to see them taken to court, but at least some of these things are coming out in the open. Right now, we are seeing the US getting hit with attacks from China because they're trying to hack into vaccine data. This is something that has come up a lot in the news. I do kind of wonder if the US, if the tables have turned and if we're hacking into other countries, but that's not the kind of thing that would make the news. There's also evidence that many other nations are as well. This, of course, also brings up a lot of ethical questions about how much this type of research should be shared and things like that. But I think it's interesting that we have some issues with nation state attacks increasing right now as the world is grappling with this pandemic. Insider attacks make the news a lot and people fear them, but they are actually not as common as you might think. A little under 80% of the time, an incident was perpetrated by an external attacker, and only about a third of the time it was perpetrated by an insider, someone internal to the organization. Now, that is still a significant amount of time. You still need to watch out for insiders, as the U.S. government learned from Bradley Manning and from Snowden, but it makes up a minority of the number of incidents that we see. By the way, if you have any questions, feel free to shout them out. Happy to have a discussion about this stuff. Again, I'm hoping that this can inform our cybersecurity tactics and programs going forward. So internal attacks are about a third. And another culprit is system administrators, but it's not that system administrators are purposefully trying to attack us 15 to 20% of the time. In fact, the reason sysadmins are behind data breaches is because of errors. Here you can see a couple of headlines. Cloud misconfigurations cost companies nearly $5 trillion. Another report found 196 data breaches, exposed more than 33 billion records. That was just because environments did not have appropriate security. And a lot of times it's because the system administrator either goofed up or didn't have the knowledge to configure something. That's becoming more and more common as cloud environments gain traction, as more people put their information out there without really investing in system administrator training. So if you are using the cloud, consider taking a class on cloud security. If you're using Amazon, take an AWS class. They have a lot of good information about it, and make sure you're investing in your human capital. Let's take a peek at the motivations. Why are attackers doing this? Well, it's cool to see the attacker motives over time. This is over a period of several years. So financial has always been a top motive, as you can see on the left. And then we see espionage. So this kind of mirrors like organized crime groups versus nation state. We have financially motivated attackers or attackers that are looking to engage in espionage. And then you have kind of some gray areas because there's definitely hackers that are contractors that will sell their data to nation state attackers or will sell their data to other people. So I am curious. I think sometimes it's not always clear how you figure out the attacker's motivations and how this is classified, but this is at least from on the surface what it appears to be. On the right, we see this interesting category, secondary as well. So financial, and that was breaches on the left. On the right, in cybersecurity incidents, financial motivations are still number one. And espionage is number three, but secondary is number two. We're going to come back to that. Secondary means that the attackers are just trying to break into a network so that they can break into somebody else's network. So you're really just a pawn in their little game. But anyway, back to ShinyHunters, you can see they're an example of an organized crime group that is financially motivated. They have stolen all these usernames and passwords, put them up on the dark web, and they are selling them for specific prices. So Tokopedia is $5,000 for all their usernames and passwords that were stolen. Home Chef, $2,500. So they're hoping to get some nice payouts for this. Based on what I have read, researchers have found that they've not made a whole lot of money off this yet, because remember, they're getting paid in Bitcoins or Monero. The Bitcoin network at least is public, and so we can see if anyone has sent money to their wallet. So it doesn't look like they've made a huge amount of money yet, but again, they are active right now. Here's another one. Gnostic Players was very prolific last year. They stole over 932 million user records. They hit 44 different companies, and they were just trying to make a buck. There, you can see them here on the dark web on an e-commerce site. Here's Evite, where you click order and you pay them their Bitcoin, and you get 10 million clear text usernames and passwords. Words with Friends is another one that they hacked that was announced back in October. 218 million Words with Friends players lose data to hackers. So you may have seen some of their activities in the news, maybe without even realizing it. And then there was the Florentine Banker group, which we talked about during our cloud webinar last month. The Florentine Banker group is an organization that we know hit at least 4 different banks, and they were engaging in business email compromise. So they would steal credentials. In one case, they targeted only 2 people within a financial investment firm. They were able to get the password from one of them. They broke in and they lurked, and they learned how the organization worked. They used that to figure out who else to target within the email system. They understood the relationships and the transactions that were about to occur. And then they started getting in the middle of conversations and getting payments redirected. They tried to get well over $1 million in payments redirected. The authorities were able to recover quite a bit of those funds, but ultimately they made off with over 600,000 pounds of money. Here's another very common case. An ice rink lost $77,000 in an email scam. And I really like this article. Check it out if you get a chance, because it goes in great depth about how the hack happened, how they received the email. They were looking to buy a new machine to resurface their ice, $77,000. They had someone send them, oh, here's a new invoice. Please send the money to a different place. And of course, then those funds were out the door, and it wasn't actually discovered until weeks later that the money was sent to the wrong place. So very classic case. The reason we're seeing ransom demands skyrocket, of course, is because criminals are looking to get a bigger and bigger payout. So in Q1 of 2020, Cover is reporting that the average ransom payment is $111,000. That's actually up 33% from Q4 of 2019. And you can see those ransom amounts going up and up and up over time. This is just in line with that trend of big game hunting, where criminals are looking for the big bucks. And that is not the top payment that they received. This is from CrowdStrike's Global Threat Report. Again, we're seeing a lot of similarities. CrowdStrike took the time to report how the top ransom demands that they saw. So Ryuk ransomware, we have $12.5 million paid. We know that from looking at those Bitcoin accounts. Doppelpaymer had $10.9 million. Revil had $10.10 million. So we are seeing some big figures that are helping to fund these organizations. And when they get these big payouts, they can then invest in better technology, more employees, and continue to level up. So it's a vicious cycle. Ransomware is on the rise, and we saw that in the data breach investigations report. So it didn't go up much in Verizon's report. The reason is that ransomware is typically considered an incident, but not a breach. Traditionally, ransomware might lock up your files, but there's not confirmed data disclosure if all the data is encrypted, according to Verizon. That is different than some state and federal laws. Ransomware did make up 27% of malware incidents this year, and we are seeing more confirmed breaches. So the number of ransomware data breaches is on the rise. They explained why that was, because there were more compromise of credentials and more cases where data was clearly exfiltrated prior to the ransomware getting installed. Now, I can tell you that number is going to go up before next year. So when we see the Verizon data breach investigation report out next year, I'm predicting that one of the big findings will be that ransomware breaches are dramatically up. And that's because of that change we've seen where ransomers have realized that they can make a lot of extra money if they threaten to expose your data to the world. So they're stealing it before they expose it. And that didn't really take off until 2020. So it's not reflected in last year's numbers, but we are going to see it reflected in this year's numbers. Mark my words. All right, speaking of people behind attacks, Anonymous, where have they been? It's been so long. Hello, Anonymous. Anonymous has returned because of the recent protests. Since this is so timely, I wanted to mention it. Anonymous, I'm not sure I would call them an organized crime group. They were quoted by an editor of The Guardian, called them a stampeding herd. And I think that's more appropriate, where, you know, a bunch of people call themselves anonymous and decide to go do something, and sometimes it gets done. Sometimes it gets done very well, sometimes not so much. So in this case, we've started to see, for example, there's a United Nations sub-agency, their website was defaced. We've started to see cases where police departments are reportedly being doxxed. So members of Anonymous have said, hey, here's all the usernames and passwords for Minneapolis police officers. However, Troy Hunt, who owns the website haveibeenpwned.com, says that those usernames and passwords probably came out of previous data breaches, and someone just pulled out things relating to that particular domain. So there's definitely a lot of activity going on right now, and it'll be interesting to see how involved Anonymous gets, because issues of equality have always triggered them to act. So let's get back to this secondary motive. We've talked about financial motives. We've talked about nation state attacks and espionage. Let's talk a little bit more about that secondary motive. One of the things that Verizon said was that because of the way they classified things, secondary looked like it was about 33% or so, 30%. But if they had included all the, I think it was all the web applications that got hacked, it would have been even more than financial. So let's dig into this a little bit. One of the places we see infrastructure is getting attacked in order to reach a third party is managed service providers. That really made the news in 2019. And here's a nice chart. You can see from the APT10 group, Cloud Hackers. So they would compromise managed IT service providers, and from there they would go into the customer's network and collect all the data that they could, and often they would stage it back at the managed service provider. So they'd get files from different customers, and then they would either exfiltrate it from there, or sometimes use one customer's network for exfiltration, depending on what was easier. So we saw a lot of these managed service provider attacks either being used to get more credentials for other organizations, or being used to install ransomware. And they're targeting those systems where there's an overlap between the MSP infrastructure and the client infrastructure. Another one is hacked websites. The market for hacked websites has just exploded. So if you've heard of Magmo is probably the most popular place on the dark web to buy yourself a hacked website. And you can buy other things too. You can buy hacked FTP sites and things like that. But mostly it is hacked websites. Since 2018, there have been 150,000 hacked websites posted. As of May 2020, there were about $750,000 worth of US goods offered and 190 threat actors that were selling access on the market. Most of the, well, about 50% of the hacked domains are .com. We also see some .org, .dk, .net, .it, and then a large amount of other. So they're focusing on .com. Obviously, those are a little bit easier to trick people into clicking on, but they're looking at a wide variety. So criminals can just go to these websites, buy themselves a hacked website and use that in part of their spam campaigns so that they can do drive-by downloads or make them part of a botnet. All right, let's take a peek at how threat actions have changed over time. On the left, you see 2015. On the right, you see the end of 2019. And some of the big things to point out here are, number one, malware is on the decline. Thank goodness. When organizations get hacked, it used to be almost 2/3 of the time it was because of malware getting installed. Today, that has completely changed. And now malware is actually one of the less prominent reasons why organizations get hacked. Instead, we're seeing a lot of malware-free instances. So this is, again, tying in with what we're seeing from CrowdStrike's Global Threat Report, which came out a couple months ago. So global malware in 2018 was 60% of cases, and malware-free was 40%. In 2019, that trend continued where malware was actually less than 50% in their cases and malware-free was over 51%. So what is a malware-free hack? Well, it could be as simple as a stolen login credential. And that makes sense because the number one way that organizations get hacked is what they call the hacking category. We'll dig into that in a moment. And then social engineering attacks. You can see the top two vectors here. This is, I think, a little more illustrative. So the number one threat action is phishing, that social attack. And the number two is use of stolen credentials, hacking. So the way criminals are hacking into your organization is through stolen passwords. Let's first talk about social engineering. I'm not going to spend too much time on phishing, but I do want to show you some of the latest that we're seeing. We are seeing a ton of hacks relating to remote work. So here's, a lot of people have really started ramping up their use of Microsoft Teams, of OneDrive, of other remote collaboration tools. We're seeing a lot of phishing campaigns that look like this. Hey, here's the weekly payment run review and approval. That's aiming at financial clerks. Office 365 voicemail. A lot of people don't have good access to their office phone systems right now. And when they see a voicemail message come in over email, they think, oh, IT must have set something up. I will click on this, and then they get hacked. Here's another one where you can click on the fiscal year 2020 information and get added to a group or participate in a group chat on Microsoft Teams. But if you hover your mouse, you can see that the link is not anything relating to Microsoft. It's buy one, get one, .xyz. So always remember to hover your mouse over it. Really good training for your teams. Here are the top hacking methods that were used in data breaches. Number one, brute force or use of stolen credentials, over 80% of cases. That right there says it all. In breaches, the top method that hackers are getting in is by hacking, and the top method that they're using to hack is through use of stolen credentials or brute force attacks. And then a much tinier percent, like 10 to 15%, they're exploiting a vulnerability, actively exploiting that vulnerability. A Microsoft executive has said, hackers don't break in, they log in. And that is as true today as it ever has been. One of the reasons we're seeing this happen is because so many passwords have been stolen. We've talked about this in the past, and there have actually been some new developments. If you remember, back in 2019, collection number one was a group of 773 million email addresses and passwords. It was just out there on the dark web. Here's what it looked like. So it was literally just a collection of stolen passwords that someone put out there. And now we actually know who that someone was, because the Ukraine has made a move to arrest the alleged hacker that was behind that collection number one data dump. So that just happened on May 20th, just a couple weeks ago. Really interesting to see law enforcement running some of these cases to ground. This is a chart from the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report that shows connection attempts by port. This shows you how common brute force hacking attacks are. So here you can see the most common ports that people are trying to connect to are 23 and 22. So who knows what 23 is? That's right, it's Telnet, and 22 is SSH. So hackers are just constantly trying to break into Telnet and SSH ports. And then there's, again, a smattering of other ports that they're also trying to break into. But these brute force attacks against popular login interfaces are super common. This whole problem is made a lot worse and a lot more complicated because after a breach happens, users rarely change their passwords. Or when they do, they change it to something weaker or maybe something that's just a variant. That's a study that, again, just came out within the past couple weeks, May 26th. It's a group of researchers from Carnegie Mellon. They were originally studying how do people change their passwords after a breach, and then they found that actually a lot of the time people don't change their passwords after a breach at all. They just continue using that hacked password, and presumably at some point it becomes an actual problem. This is in line with what Microsoft found at the end of 2019. They did an analysis of passwords on their system, and they compared it to databases that were known to have been dumped in data breaches. And what they found is that known compromised passwords are still used on 44 million Microsoft accounts. Hackers don't break in, they log in. Change your passwords. The other big surprise, I don't know if it's a surprise, but finding from the data breach investigations report is that errors are up. The number of errors has increased significantly, specifically misconfiguration over the past couple of years. So misconfiguration is that line in blue, and misconfiguration used to only make up less than 10% of breaches just a few years ago. Now it's over 40% of all breaches. One of the reasons we're seeing this, of course, is because of that rush to the cloud. Human error is often the culprit in cloud breaches, says one headline. We saw that probably the most widely reported breach of the year was Capital One. We don't see a lot of financial institutions get hacked. Capital One was hacked because of a misconfiguration of their Amazon cloud platform. We see that happening all the time. Here's another one. Microsoft had to report a data breach because they accidentally misconfigured their own Azure systems. They own it, their own Azure systems, and they left 250 million customer service records open to the web. If Microsoft cannot correctly configure Azure, what does that mean for the rest of us? So remember, system administrators and end users made up a significant percentage of the top threat actors, often unintentionally. Let's talk about end users for a second. One way that this really came up over the past couple months in the coronavirus, in the wake of coronavirus, was with Zoom. Zoom allows users to record videos and keep them in a lot of different places. And one of the places that users are keeping their videos is in Amazon S3 buckets. And they can set that up by default. They can view it later. What they often don't realize is that those S3 buckets are public. And Zoom's naming convention for those files was fairly easy to predict. So researchers were able to find these videos, which often had very sensitive and personal conversations. So this was actually an end user configuration video, or an end user configuration issue, but Zoom is in the headline. The other really interesting thing that Verizon noted is who is reporting errors. So the number one group reporting errors are security researchers that are discovering them. And this might explain why errors are going up, because five years ago, 10 years ago, nobody was really looking for information that had been publicly posted online. And now security researchers have these standard methods of scanning for open Amazon S3 buckets and things like that. So third parties tend to be the ones discovering and reporting errors. It is rarely reported internally. You can see reported by employee is a teeny tiny percentage. Makes you wonder how much of the time errors are happening and being discovered internally and just not getting reported. When it's reported by a security researcher or by some unrelated third party, then it's much harder for breach organizations to sweep that under the rug or to hide that, and you're much more likely to see that, going to insurance or getting notified or going through a notification process. So this is by a company called UpGuard. This article you see on the right, check your Amazon S3 permissions. Someone will. That's true, because often they are checked by UpGuard themselves. UpGuard made a name for themselves over the past few years by automatically scanning for open S3 buckets. And they found tons. They found Chicago voter records. They found secret NSA and Army data. They found patient information. It was just article after article after article critical. And there's pros and cons to that. Their findings absolutely drove Amazon to make changes in the way that you configure S3 buckets. They kind of forced Amazon to come out with tools that made it easier for users to tell if a bucket was public and lock it down proactively. At the same time, it kind of makes you wonder, it's not that the number of errors themselves are on the rise necessarily, but that we are finding them more often. Again, that inherent bias that happens because of the way breaches get reported. In order for a breach to get reported, first it has to be detected. If you don't know your information is out there, it's not going to get reported as a breach, right? So because security researchers are looking at these things, we're finding errors are up. Then the issue has to be recognized as a data breach. And many organizations don't recognize it as a breach because they don't even know the legal definition of a breach. Many organizations say, oh, shoot, that data was online. Well, let's just take it down and go on about our day. And of course, that can put you in jeopardy of violating state and federal data breach notification laws or things like that. But, there's a chance you might never get found. And then finally, there needs to be that decision made by an executive team or by a third party to disclose the issue. So in order for a breach to get out there and get public and also get in the data set, it needs to be detected, it needs to be recognized, and there needs to be some form of disclosure. The vast majority of data breaches are almost certainly never publicly reported. And I can tell you just from our caseload here at LMG, most things that I would consider breaches do not make the headlines. Speaking of things that don't make the headlines, let's talk about some changes and things that we don't have to worry about anymore. Where did all the crypto mining go? A year or two ago, cryptocurrency was all the rage, and crypto mining and crypto jacking was as well. So here's a couple articles: cryptocurrency miners, a replacement for ransomware. So we're not going to see as much ransomware. We're going to see criminals just break in and install cryptocurrency miners and make a bunch of money that way and try to lurk on your systems. And yeah, that happens, but not as much as it seemed at the time. This year, crypto mining made up 2.5% of malware and of breaches, and then 1.5% of malware in incidents. One question is that cryptocurrency mining may be underreported, because if you find a cryptocurrency miner on a system, that might not trigger a potential data breach investigation. People might say, okay, it's a miner, I'm going to clean it off and go about my day. So it may be that these are simply underreported, or it may be that cryptocurrency mining just doesn't make you as much money anymore. At its peak, it was huge, and then the value, like Monero is a great example, that you can see the value of Monero declining, and with it declined criminals' interest in cryptocurrency mining. So that volatility is a problem. Point of sale hacks are also down dramatically. This is a huge change. When I started writing my book on data breaches, it was 2015, and point of sale system hacking was at its peak. I think it was something like 50 or 60% of cases in retail were point of sale hacks. We saw credit card numbers getting stolen. They were put out there on the dark web for sale. It was very dramatic. Many retailers got hacked. But since that time, we've seen a lot of changes happen in the industry. One of those is an increase in the adoption of EMV, the chip and pin. In the United States, chip and pin as of December 2019 is now prevalent almost 63% of the time in the United States. That's huge. That's actually a huge increase over the past several years. It's up almost 9% compared with the year before. And it's just harder for hackers to clone those cards to conduct fraud when you're using EMV. But it doesn't mean that criminals are going away. Whoops, I think I have one more slide here. It doesn't mean that criminals are going away. It actually just means that criminals have moved to card not present fraud. So instead of relying on physical in-person transactions, they're hacking e-commerce sites, and there are a lot of different ways that they can do that. So they're not going away, they're just changing their tactics. So that is why point of sale, just to come back to this for a second, it still happens, but it is not nearly as huge a deal as it was several years ago. Today, all the major card brands banded together to, actually here, one thing that I've noticed also is the number of contactless payments are up. Excuse me, this is another reason why in-person transaction hacking is down because we saw that increase in EMV. And now because of COVID-19, MasterCard reported that contactless payments are up 40% just since the beginning of this year because you don't, it's great. I've been using it all the time. You don't have to sign anything. You don't have to use that dirty little pen that comes with the reader or anything like that. You literally just hold your phone up to it. And this is a great thing for merchants as well, because most of these contactless payment systems also deploy advanced security techniques like encryption and tokenization. And that means that merchants never have your credit card number, and so it can't be stolen by attackers in this process. So that's huge. So right now, again, point of sale hacking is making up 0.8% of attacks. And my guess is that with contactless payments, it's going to be even lower than that by this time next year. So that's an exciting change. So where are the criminals going? They are going to the web applications. You can see point of sale attacks are down. Web application attacks are up about 50% of the time. And how are they breaking into web applications? Number one, use of stolen credentials. Are we starting to see a trend here? So you have an Amazon account, you have an account on some other e-commerce site, and they're going to steal your credentials as a consumer. This is an especially huge problem for both consumers and retailers because how many of us can really remember a totally unique password for every different online e-commerce site that you use? It just doesn't happen. Consumers want to use the same password over and over again, or they want to make it easy. Retailers really can't force them to use a great password because they might get discouraged and just go to a different retailer. We still have about 40% of the time that there's exploitation of a vulnerability in the e-commerce site that happens. And about, looks like 15% of the time there's a brute force attack. So again, going back to those stolen credentials. So really interesting trend that we are continuing to see. And the card brands are, by the way, I think I forgot to mention, I am a spokesperson for MasterCard, so I just want to make sure that's clear. But as a researcher, this is something that I'm seeing, which I think is interesting. Okay, so here you can see again that as criminals are moving, that criminals are not going away. This is a percentage of this is how much card not present fraud is occurring as a percentage of the overall card fraud. So in the EU, this is relatively consistent. In the EU, they've been using chip and PIN for a long, long time. And so these numbers are not really changing. But in the US, as chip and PIN increasingly becomes adopted, we are seeing more and more card not present fraud. Those are the lines in blue. And just in the past year, there has been a huge uptick in card not present fraud. And so retailers are trying to find other solutions. A big development at the end of 2019 was that the card brands launched a new click to pay button. And instead of requiring people to log in with a username and password, it uses more advanced analytics like being able to differentiate between different devices. Behavioral analytics, also determining the likelihood that a transaction is fraudulent based on the location, the device, things like that. So they're trying to find ways for consumers to, and standardize throughout the industry, but trying to find ways for consumers to use e-commerce without having to rely on that username and password that is so commonly stolen and used for fraud. So with that, I'm going to sum up our key takeaways from the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report. Our perpetrators are primarily organized crime groups who are financially motivated. Secondary, we also see nation-state attacks and espionage. The methods that they use are, the top two methods are phishing attacks and passwords. No surprise, protect your passwords. Errors are up. They are probably up partly because of the adoption and the rush to the cloud, but also because security researchers and third parties are now looking for those errors and reporting them. And more ransomware cases are breaches. We do anticipate over the next year that there will be an increase in the number of ransomware cases that are also classified as data breaches. How can you defend yourself? Well, number one, use that two-factor authentication, especially with an app. And you can check out LMG's website for examples, lmgsecurity.com/passwords. Make sure that you think before you click and you train your team to do that as well. And finally, check your configuration, especially your cloud configuration. Take the time, do that double check. I've been talking for an hour. Feel free to call LMG if you need any help with that. But just taking the time to go through the configuration and making sure that it's what you expect it to be can really save you some errors. And with that, again, just a reminder that we have that Cyber Summer Intensive Training event. If you want to take a class on data breaches and learn how to respond to ransomware or cloud breaches, if you want to take a class on physical access control systems and learn to do red team testing, we are doing that online for the first time. Check it out. I'm so excited. And that's it. I think we have about 10 minutes left for questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sherry. We did have a few questions that came up from our audience during the presentation. The first one is, do you think COVID-19 will change any of these trends? Next year, will this look different?
Yeah, this is a great question. We are absolutely seeing COVID-19 creating a larger attack surface. So more RDP interfaces, more cloud interfaces. We are also seeing organizations start to get these under control. So the number of login interfaces out there on the internet is now it's past its peak. It's starting to decline a little bit. But I do anticipate that passwords are going to continue to be a problem over the next year.
Thank you. The next question. It's really hard to get rid of passwords in our organization. So many applications depend on it. How do we deal with this?
Yeah, this is a great question and a big challenge. How do you actually get rid of passwords? I would say, number one, you have to be realistic. Don't expect people to remember a zillion different passwords. It's really important to start by giving people the tools they need to manage passwords effectively. So get a password manager deployed across the board if you don't already have one. I've seen organizations use LastPass, Dashlane, 1Password. Those are all really good ones, and there's some other good ones as well. So get that password manager deployed and then take it one step at a time. If you can get two-factor authentication turned on, do it. Make sure you're doing single sign-on wherever you can, and encourage people to use that password manager so they're picking good passwords.
Thank you. The last question I see today is, are there any reports that you recommend reading to get a good understanding of the state of cybersecurity?
Sure, obviously the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report is a great one, but you know it now. I've also always enjoyed the Symantec Internet Security Threat Report, the ISTR McAfee, no, is it McAfee? Malwarebytes has a good one about the state of malware. So it just depends on what your area of interest is. IBM also releases a report regularly about the cost of a breach that is always pretty eye-opening.
All right, that's the end of our questions today. And thank you, Sherry. Once again, this is Deanna Keller with LMG Security. We would like to thank everyone who attended. Please take a moment to fill out the survey afterwards and let us know what you thought. The recorded webinar from the presentation and any handouts that we are able to provide will be made available to the attendees, and we will send out a notification once this is live. Thank you, and I hope everyone has a great day.